You on our event, we have an honor to welcome our guests, Mr. Bruno Lete, expert at the German Marshall Fund, and I am happy to welcome Ms. Nataliya Nemylivska, director at the Center for the NATO Information and Documentation. The symbolism of this event is dual, so to say. Tomorrow, the Warsaw NATO Summit is beginning. We do not expect this summit to bring a lot of surprises, but nevertheless. And the second aspect is that we would like to give the floor to Mr. Bruno Lete, who will present the results, the outputs of his huge work, which he carried out during last 2 years. In Kiev, during the last 6 months, we had held seminars with representatives of the government, representatives of the Western countries, and those seminars, consultations were aimed at producing recommendations as to the Ukraine's position in Warsaw Summit. I'm happy that we started jointly that work in December last year, and for me it's a big honor to be present at the final presentation of this huge work. First, I will give the floor to Mr. Bruno Lete and then to Nataliya Nemylivska, who supported implementation of this initiative. And later we will have a discussion, Q&A session. We have representatives of the those workshops, the participants of those workshops, seminars, and I will listen to them.
Well, sorry that I cannot address you in your home language. Despite those many travels to Ukraine, I still didn't manage to actually learn the language, but so it will have to be in English. Thank you so much for hosting this. Also for me, quite an honor, that we can do this together. IWP, in my opinion, certainly one of the leading think tanks in Ukraine when it comes to security issues. So thank you very much for hosting us, and a pleasure to be with you on this panel, Nataliya. Usual suspect and partner in crime, if I may say that way, in many different things that we're doing. So quite a pleasure to be here. Just shortly, perhaps, to get started, the German Marshall Fund has quite a long history in working on issues related to Ukraine, including the Ukraine-NATO relationship. And the report that we want to present today fits in that tradition. As you said, it's the result of intensive travels between Brussels and Kiev, and we've been talking to many stakeholders in both cities, and many of you are sitting in the room, I see, and I also want to express my thanks to you because you were part of that creative process. And so it is there, the report is the output with concrete recommendations for Ukraine on how to advance its NATO integration. And we are proud at GMF to have been able to do this project. I think for us it's also a way to show our commitment to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. And I think that in these times of conflict and uncertainty, it is important more than ever before then to stress this need for an ever larger Euro-Atlantic community. And in my personal opinion, but also in the opinion of my organization, Ukraine should be part of this Euro-Atlantic community. Just to say that as a start. Talking about Euro-Atlantic integration, this starts here in Kiev, at home. It doesn't start in Brussels or in Washington, and I think that this is one of the main points of our report, that Ukraine's top priority should be its domestic policies. Ukraine has to continue to demonstrate its ability to reform its public, private, and military sector. It has to show its ability to do that, not only to NATO, but also to itself. Because there is a direct link between these reforms and support in Western capital cities for the NATO-Ukraine partnership. And I think this is a very important overarching point to make before kickstarting this conversation. It starts here in Kiev or in Ukraine. I will not go too much into the details of the report. I hope that you will have the time to read it, or that you already had the opportunity to read it. But perhaps there's three general points I want to make, and I think it will nicely summarize the ideas that we came up with. The first point, it's all about communication. Ukraine needs to rebalance or rethink slightly its communication towards NATO. Today's narrative, Ukraine's narrative, is too much focused on expectations. It's too much focused on expectations for membership. It's too much based on the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, while the circumstances, the political circumstances in 2008 inside the alliance are very different than the political circumstances today. There is this disconnect. So rather than focusing on expectations, we suggest to refocus Ukraine's messaging on achievements. The achievements of a successful transformation since Euromaidan 2014. This country, de facto a country at war, has taken giant leaps forward in terms of reform for the past 2 years. And we need to communicate about that. Communicating about this successful transformation will fight disinformation about Ukraine in Western capital cities. It will fight negative perceptions among audiences in Western capitals about Ukraine. And it will also offer Ukraine, I would say, measurable and rational arguments to push NATO's open door, to communicate about these successful transformations. Now, again, to do so, it starts again at home. Ukraine needs better strategic communications at home in order to get a better message, a better narrative abroad. There must be more coordination inside the government and in between governmental bodies to have a unifying narrative, one message, one story that you can tell. There we need to still have some work to do, we believe. But in that respect, and perhaps Nataliya can say a bit more about that, there's a very useful document called the NATO-Ukraine Strategic Communication Partnership Roadmap, if I'm correct about the name, which deserves more attention, which should be put more in the center of that strategy. And working towards 2017. Why 2017? It's because next year will mark 20 years of NATO-Ukraine relations. So there's a very important public momentum to leverage. And we should think perhaps creatively what we can do in terms of initiative around this 20th anniversary. So these are all points that we made around a better communication strategy. The second overarching point that we looked into is that Ukraine needs to think more what it can do for NATO, and not only think about what NATO can do for Ukraine. I think this is a very important point as well. Every aspirant member state, or aspirant country, let's put it that way, needs to demonstrate its added value to NATO's collective defense and security system. And Ukraine will not be an exception to that. But there are fields that we identified where Ukraine could contribute very positively to allied capabilities, experience, and expertise. There's two concrete ones that I would like to highlight. The first one is actually Ukraine's capability to contribute to NATO's strategic airlifting capacity. Ukraine has a fleet of very useful Antonovs, strategic airlifter Antonov fleets, where NATO de facto has a bit of a capability gap, especially the European allies. And so the idea was to explore whether Ukraine could contribute to some NATO operations by enabling these Antonovs there. So that was one possible avenue forward that we were looking to. The other one is, it's about hybrid warfare. Ukraine is probably the only country in the world today which is fighting a hybrid war against a major power. You've seen it all here, from propaganda to disinformation in social media and traditional media, rebellious groups, business and political networks of influence, the exploitation of minorities' grievances. Ukraine has acquired a unique expertise and experience in those fields. And today, NATO has started to think about these issues, but is perhaps not yet in a position where it can successfully and effectively address those challenges. It's still working on, the alliance is still working on that. So the idea was to see if Ukraine could create a center of expertise for hybrid warfare, where such center should develop doctrine and theory about hybrid warfare, should offer training and education to staff, and perhaps also act like a database for lessons learned and best practices in the field of hybrid warfare. So these are all ideas that that could enable Ukraine to contribute to NATO and to profile Ukraine as an attractive security provider for the alliance. And then perhaps the last point I wanted to make, and this is not directly linked to NATO, but more in general, we recommend Ukraine to also think about a much more cooperative diplomacy, a much more active foreign policy in the region. There's still space to set up more cooperation projects with neighboring countries. In the north we think about Belarus with all the challenges that there are, but you could leverage certain cultural similarities to get more insight on domestic developments inside Minsk. And of course to work with NATO partners and NATO member states around the Black Sea to engage in risk reduction in that region, which is a very important and worrying issue in the Black Sea nowadays. Ukraine has already engaged in important initiatives, such as the common brigades with Poland and Lithuania. I think there are similar efforts ongoing now with Romania and Bulgaria. But more could be done as well. And one idea that we suggest is perhaps to see if Ukraine could lead an effort to set up some sort of defense cluster, a Black Sea defense cluster, very much to the example of what exists in the Benelux or Nordic DEFCO. Is this an option that is feasible, something to be explored? And finally also, we really recommend to invest more effort in the relationship with Georgia. Georgia and Ukraine have the same ambitions when it comes to NATO. And so that relationship really needs more attention and content. And perhaps working together would allow both countries to place the open door policy higher up on the policy agenda of NATO. So these are a select amount of recommendations that I wanted to highlight about the report. And happy to answer any other questions that there are. Thank you.
Pani Nataliya Nemylivska.
Ms. Nataliya Nemylivska, we are ready to hear your comments. So the first section of the report is directly related to the work of your center, how your center is ready to respond to this challenge and to support Ukraine in reshaping its communication with NATO. I understand that it's not easy, but nevertheless, I hope that you are capable to cope with this dimension. Thank you very much. A year ago, when we launched the project, we kept in mind this summit, which will start tomorrow. The idea was to strengthen capacity of Ukraine in communicating abroad and in communicating to those member countries who to allow Ukraine to hear what are the expectations of member countries and what Ukraine, having understood this, what Ukraine could offer to those countries. This project was part of our partnership, which we founded a year ago. As Bruno mentioned, this was partnership in strategic communication. This was totally new. cooperational direction for NATO, and Ukraine is, as of today, the only country. So our objective was to develop the most strategic approach to communication between Ukraine and member countries, societies in member countries, different communities in those countries. And our objective was that that communication should strengthen Ukraine's international position and would work for the benefit of both Ukraine and NATO countries. And NATO countries support Ukraine very much and strengthen their support more and more. If Ivan Kirillovich agrees, I'm happy to give the floor to him because he was participant of the workshops, he was participant of our work on the paper, and Mr. Yevhen Marchuk in 2002 was that very person who declared Ukraine's intention to join NATO. And that was a long path from Prague to Warsaw tomorrow. What is your vision of further cooperation of Ukraine with NATO after Warsaw Summit? Thank you very much for this opportunity. First of all, I would like to express some ideas and to point out to some aspects which may change the public opinion in Ukraine related to Russian aggression in our country. First of all, I would like to draw attention to the following aspect. Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the Warsaw Summit will start, and Ukraine has big expectations as to possible decisions about future assistance to Ukraine. Something around 40 different programs might be passed during the summit. And my question is to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, what the ministry plans to do in order to implement all those programs in case they are passed. As of today, we do not have Ukrainian representatives in NATO. We have Mr. Bashko, who is a top professional. He is the executive representative, but the name of his position clearly shows that we do not have the fully authorized permanent representative of Ukraine in NATO after Mr. Dolgov left this position a year ago. The next my statement is, okay, we mentioned 40 different programs of NATO support to Ukraine, while we cannot mention any state Ukrainian program of Ukrainian contribution to NATO countries. The national program in Ukraine, which should be passed by the government and approved by the president, should consist 1/3 from the military component and 2/3 of the other organizational components. And when thinking about this aspect, we clearly understand that 28 member states in Europe observe not just military aspects of our all national programs, but monitor also the biggest part of them, which is civil part, organizational part of that programs. So what I wish to say, mention in this, when we had established the position of Vice Prime Minister on European integration and mention Ms. Tsintsadze, Ivanna Tsintsadze, who is responsible for Euro integration, it immediately comes to mind that before this position, which was established in early spring, we had no such position. We had no such a person coordinating cooperation with NATO, not just in military sphere, but in all other spheres, like in civil aspects. Mr. Stoltenberg is a very reputable person, but this is not his personal position which shapes the attitude of NATO as an organization to NATO. This is position of 28 member countries which shapes their attitude to Ukraine. That's why we should always remember this. And when the NATO members will think about the membership or access or association regime for Ukraine, this won't be just Mr. Stoltenberg, this will be 28 countries. And then again, I began to think about our enforcement agencies. For example, the Ministry of Emergency Situations. And I recollect how cooperation of those ministries was organized in the past. This we opened vacancies for deputy ministers who had to cooperate with NATO, not at military level, but in many other civil aspects. So my message is that there is a huge space for civil society, for non-military agencies to cooperate with NATO. For example, Ministry of Information. To what extent they are involved in cooperation with NATO today? Nevertheless, there are a lot of issues which this ministry could present to NATO as in the aspects of the lessons learned. Also, we can, for example, involve the Ministry of Education and allow them to, and request them to introduce the training course for universities describing Ukraine-NATO relations. So, for the governmental structures, for the administration of the president, there is a huge need to pay attention at organization of this cooperation with NATO, not just at military level, but at in all other spheres. By the way, this is closely related to other reforms, like, for example, reform of judiciary. There is an open document, Ukraine-NATO Action Plan. It is in public access. You can review it and see that 2/3 of that document does not deal with military cooperation. It deals with other sorts of cooperation. And if we wish to get understanding from Brussels, we should clearly demonstrate that we are moving forward in transition. Despite the war, nevertheless, we should move forward in changing the country. And without showing this, without this commitment, without clear evidence that there are changes for the future, we won't get further support. Of course, during the war, it's not easy to implement these changes. Everybody who is familiar with the governmental work knows how difficult it is, but we should do this. When we speak about strategic communications, maybe I will express more criticism in this issue than other people. I would like to express more criticism about Ukrainian part of these relations. It is insufficient communication from Ukrainian side, both at with the headquarters and with the member countries. Ukrainian civil society is very weakly very weak in this communication. There is a very simplified point of view, widespread in the society, that since we are since we are having a warfare in the east, then NATO should help us. That NATO is interested in defending its eastern flanks. But I don't think it's right approach. And moreover, it's very difficult to get rid of this wrongful point of view. But at the governmental level, we should gradually give up from this perception and gradually come to the idea what we should do. Since we have chosen the vector of Euro-Atlantic integration, and this is reflected in the legislation, in Ukrainian legislation, although Yanukovych made an attempt to withdraw this point from our legislation, but nevertheless that we have a clear statement, we had a clear statement in our legislation that Ukraine can join any military unions in defending its sovereign integrity, including NATO. But we should be realistic. We have to focus our attention on our efforts and our contribution. What contribution should our state institutions make into the European security? I think that if today we would like to assess the work of our governmental institutions in this area, this will be rather low, like level C or even D in international scale of marks. Besides the Minister of Defense today, we have nobody who is responsible for cooperation with NATO today. Except the Minister of Defense, nobody, including presidential administration, while there is a huge amount of work. Of course, we may have some criticism as to NATO, as to the late response of NATO to Russian aggression. For example, General Hodges recently mentioned the same criticism. So we may express some criticism as to NATO reaction to Russian aggression. And Mr. Rasmussen recognized that NATO was not ready to respond to Russian annexation of Crimea. This only underscores that Ukraine has a huge field for activities. And I would suggest that NATO should predict unpredictable. 2 years ago, it was unpredictable that Russia might start aggression against Ukraine, and I'm happy that today we have serious changes, and we hope that in Warsaw Summit, besides the discussion about Ukraine, we will hear the new strategy of NATO in result of Russian aggression. Thank you very much for your attention. Alexei Melnik. Maybe we will unite several questions, for example, 3 questions. Alexei Melnik.
So, short remark. Firstly, I would like to thank for the opportunity to take part in this discussion and welcome the organizers and the colleagues who are present here, because I believe that this is a quality document and we can take it not as a basis, but we can take it into account while developing documents both in Ukraine and in NATO. And of course, there were some reflections of my own ideas in this document, and maybe I do not agree with some statements, and I would like to say that Bruno maybe should take into account his opinions also in other documents concerning help, assistance. One of the problems is that the assistance provided from charities, and also it is important that help should be provided from NATO as the investment in the security of European region, not only as just help to Ukraine. And we hope that this topic will be discussed, that it should be done not only geographically, but also it should be done here in Ukraine, and also the strategic communication. This is a problematic issue. The problem is not that we do not have success in the sphere, but even though success that we have, one of them, the most bright example that was discussed, Ukraine has this tragedy in this territory, and it was able to prevent the crisis of refugees in Europe. We have many problems, but it didn't become a problem for Europe. And there should be clear assessment of this, because we are not a failed state. Andrei Klimenko, head of Crimean Department of Maidan Foreign Affairs, chief editor of internet portal CNews Yalta. And we have our office moved from Yalta in 2014 to Kiev. Mr. Lete did a great job, and what I was able to read, I really needed to know the information this was really interesting, and of course I found the word Black Sea and Black Sea region there, but I would like to focus the attention on this. We are dealing with this Black Sea region starting from 2010. We understand that in the media they use this term, and we understand what is implicated. And tomorrow we are going to publish a project report that will be called Maritime Presence of NATO in the Black Sea region in the context of the occupation and militarization of Crimea. And we will publish this report in order that those experts in this issue, they could make their comments. And I invite everyone to do this. What I want to say is that there are talks about what should be done and how to enforce the presence of NATO in the Black Sea region, and these talks are really optimistic. The facts are opposite. Starting from 20th of February 2014, so starting from special operation of Russia to occupy Crimea, the military ships of NATO, except of Bulgaria, Turkey, and they covered 80% of those 350 days that were from 20th of February. So 80%, they were permanently there, military ships. These were the ships of the United States of America and other countries of NATO, and the European countries and Canada. And I believe, and I'm sure, that the presence, especially these were missile ships and destroyers and frigates, Italian, Spanish, French, that are integrated in the Aegis system, that it was a powerful prevention system. And in 2015, each month there were NATO ships, and their battle readiness increased and their number increased. There were more destroyers, more frigates and other ships, and they covered less days. And in 2016, so this half year ended several days ago, and there were only 30% of calendar covered by the presence of the ships. And the number of these ships fall 4 times. So we see that Mr. Borisov, the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, torpedoed the Romanian idea of the Black Sea NATO fleet. And if we read between the lines, we see that on the 30th of June, President Poroshenko was in Bulgaria, and in the interview to Bulgarian TV channel, he said, we are not only focused on a military fleet, we can create a battalion maybe. Why do I say this? In Europe, there was an old disease. They underestimate the Black Sea region, and they underestimate this region. They look at Brussels, at the Atlantic, and as of today, Putin won the Black Sea. Today, you understand, we can compare, as many experts do, they estimate VAT, the number of the military, and other parameters. But as of today, tactically, Putin won the Black Sea. Here is 7 ships that carry nuclear weapons, 3 frigates and small ships. They are carriers of caliber missiles, and all the world believe that they can launch for 300 kilometers, and they launched when they were celebrated Putin's birthday. They launched these missiles, and they can launch for 1,500, and there are evidence they can launch for 2,600. So there are Iskanders, the Bastions, and the Bals, and if we will make a radius of 1,500, this is Naples and Riga. And if we increase, so in this case, I would like to say that we should actively cooperate with European structures, with NATO, and with Nataliya. In Monte, I spoke about those issues, and because the Black Sea region, as of today, represents a threat, very serious threat, and provocations of Russia in the Baltics and in the north. These are some distracting things, and there are 7 plus 2, 3 ships, large ships. They have the opportunity to land the troops, assault troops, in the territory of Ukraine. So, please, the next speaker. Firstly, I would like to say that this was a great report, and we like the conclusions, but the approach should be somehow different. Expectations and achievements and resultativeness. And what is the expectation of power about our NATO integration? Some people believe that ATO is not a war, and there are some institutions and Deputy Prime Minister who is responsible for Euro integration. So we should establish clear goals, but we do not have clear goals. And the Institute of World Policy, from the first page, they stated that there is no clear integration, declared provisions, and Yanukovych destroyed all the structures and institutions, and we didn't renew these institutions. And our plan is not ambitious. It remained connected with the times of Yanukovych. And they speak only about military things. But Evgeny Kirillovich mentioned that there should be comprehensive reforms and integration, and that should be renewal. And all the countries and experience we know about Roland Asmus, who declared that in 2012 there will be a Warsaw Summit and Ukraine will become a member. And the experience of countries that got the access to NATO, we should prove, not only declare. We should carry out our obligations according to the standards, and we should make contribution. We have a program, and NATO is a strategic choice. And after Brexit, we see that there are low expectations of the European Union and the regime, and NATO is the only institution that shows the stability and understanding of security matters. So not only military component is important. So the matter is, there should be a message to society about reforms, that we go in this direction. Montenegro went there for 10 years, and the declaration we make about European integration. This is the part of synergy together with Europe. So our ambitions in Warsaw, they it is not only about open doors. What expectations can we have? So for the first time, society, and Poroshenko stated that 75% declared that if in October there was a referendum last year, 75% would support this choice. So 46% support to the idea, now 44% support. So in this way, people got disillusioned in the ideas. So there should be a requirement to restore in the declaration of the summit, there should be stated about the prospects of to Ukraine to join NATO, and also Groisman said in his dialogue with Mr. Steinmeier that Russia is a threat, and there should be open doors, and Warsaw Summit should, and that was stated, and we after Ilovaisk we asked for help, and we the proposal and hope to see that this message, strategic decision, should be a clear signal to Europe and the world and to NATO that about our expectations. And Mr. Stoltenberg said that you should make a statement, make a declaration, and we should show to society where we move to, and to create programs and to implement it through the ministry, and there should be strategic communication, and the public, the civil society organizations should be participants of these processes, and we should clearly understand what NATO is. NATO is peace and great leading partners, and there is no political will now in the country. So we should start this process, and we should have high expectations of the summit, and we should deliver our promises. And the Center of Conversion of the Military, they also write some declarations that the NATO should also start actions, and we should hear what our society wants, and we should adhere to this process, and we should have clear understanding of this process. So it is interesting to hear about the efforts of NATO and NATO attention to the Black Sea region. Maybe you know that the leadership of Ukraine supported Bucharest initiative on creating the Black Sea Fleet, but unfortunately Bulgaria at the last moment, maybe because of obvious reasons, rejected the idea. Maybe in NATO there will be enough convincing evidence to change this opinion in Bulgaria. And maybe what are the views, what is the strategy of NATO in this area? Because your recommendations that Ukraine should be de facto NATO member state, and the Ukraine created the brigade with Poland and Lithuania, and we are speaking about integration with NATO countries, and Ukraine expressed a will for integration de facto in this in the sea region. So about the NATO partnership in this process.
And also a couple of other things that I heard. But to start on the Black Sea, again, Black Sea is of increasing importance to the alliance. And as I said in my recommendation, I do believe that Ukraine can play a pivotal role to that respect, and should include that in its future messaging. Admittedly, it is true that NATO, for the past 2 years or so, has dedicated quite a lot of attention to the defense of the Baltics and Poland. one of the results of the Warsaw Summit will be the placement of 4 battalions, rotating battalions on that part of the eastern flank. But the Black Sea is of increasing importance to the alliance, and also in Warsaw I think we'll see certain results coming out of that. I agree with your assessment that we should not underestimate the militarization of the Black Sea. In our opinion, the Crimea is effectively being transformed into a hub for Russian A2AD capabilities, which basically undermines NATO's strategy of quick reinforcement in case there would be crisis, as was designed under the Readiness Action Plan. The Readiness Action Plan in 2014 was basically NATO's military strategy not to be present on the ground, but if there would be a crisis, we would send forces to help you out. Now, Russian A2AD is undermining this strategy. That's why now in 2016 in Warsaw, we're actually moving away from quick reinforcement to making sure the troops are already there on the ground. This is what's now happening in the Baltics, this is what's now happening in Poland, and we're now working with the alliance towards such strategy in the Black Sea as well. A testimony of that is, for instance, the missile defense system went online in Romania just recently. Turkey, an important NATO ally, is also now working on creating a standing maritime mission in the sea. Bulgaria pulled out for its own reasons, as you pointed out, but we haven't declared defeat yet on that front. I think there's still some space to wiggle around with what other options could be to get a Bulgarian contribution to that force. Now, of course, the challenge there as well is you're with the Montreux Convention, which is of course always the key document when you talk about a maritime presence in the Black Sea. Now, Turkey, and I was there about 2 weeks ago, was in Ankara, is definitely dedicated to creating a better defense for the Black Sea, but it also wants to respect the rules indicated in the Montreux Convention. But again, the Montreux Convention does not exclude a foreign, meaning non-Black Sea littoral country presence in the Black Sea. I think a NATO ally or any country that is not part of the Black Sea littoral can have a presence there for 21 days. And then basically you have to pull out of the region. So there again, we can think about some sort of rotational standing maritime force. That would be one of the solutions. So NATO is really thinking about that. I think there's an increasing realization that just like what we're now seeing happening in Kaliningrad or even on the western border with Belarus, that these similar trends are now happening in the Crimea as well, and potentially undermine NATO strategy in the region. And again, I would also like to think a bit grander, because it's not only Eastern Europe and the Crimea. What we really see is a similar A2AD militarization strategy stretching from the Arctic to the Baltics, to the Black Sea, to the Caucasus, to the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's basically this iron arch, like I like to call it, that we need to address. So it's bigger than just the Black Sea and Eastern Europe. A couple of points that I heard. On the NUC meeting, I think it was the first contributor, the NATO-Ukraine Commission tomorrow, and I hear your questions around the 40 programs or so that Ukraine and NATO will be signing. It's probably, as we would say, an issue of absorption capacity on the Ukrainian side. And we've seen similar issues as well, for instance, already with the trust funds that were designed in the Warsaw Summit. But then again, and I think that it's important to, even though we know this issue is there, it's important to already set the content. If you sign off on these 40 programs or so, at least you already have a framework, you have the content. We can talk about format later. We'll go step by step and see how we can implement, but you need the content to be on paper, and I think this is really important also to show that NATO is absolutely dedicated to help Ukraine defend itself to these challenges. Also, I think it was you again, sir, that mentioned Ukraine's contribution to NATO. I absolutely agree with that. It's standing in the paper. It's been written in the paper as well, but the issue there, of course, is before Ukraine can contribute to NATO, we also need to work on the interoperability of armed forces, the interoperability between Ukrainian armed forces and NATO armed forces. And there I think there's a key document, the blueprint or roadmap that Ukraine would modernize its armed forces by 2020. It's really important that Ukraine, meets that ambitious timeline, because there again, if it fails to do so, I think it would really jeopardize Ukraine's credibility toward the alliance. So it's really important that we stick to that. And again, it's an issue of Stratcom as well. Showing this credibility will send a positive signal to the alliance. All that actually makes me think about a quote in one of my favorite books written by Lampedusa, a Sicilian author, which said that things have to change in order to remain the same. And Ukraine really has to change in order to make sure that the NATO-Ukraine partnership remains the same, because someone mentioned it in the audience as well, we should not take NATO support for granted. It's not like that Ukraine cannot be complacent in thinking that NATO will always grumble, but in the end nothing will change. So this is definitely something that we should take into account. So just a quick reaction to some points. I'm happy to elaborate further.
Please take the mic. Igor Kagamanenko, head of Ukrainian Agency on Prospect Developments and head of Coordination Council of all Ukrainian organization, the Force of Law. I would like to thank for this comprehensive analysis. This is systemic and really powerful. And in this context, I would like to say some things about it. First, about strategic communication. I fully agree with it, but in the context of the priorities, we should support communications, and we should make priorities, establish priorities in the context of forming the School of Strategic Communication, because we have different understanding on strategic communications. Some people believe that this is counter-propaganda. Other people believe that this is some things that are directed to speak about some ambitious plans and about some important things concerning with prospects. And this communications should be built on truth, and there should be horizontal and vertical developments, and the formation of culture, the formation of school. This is the priority in this. Also, I believe that Ukraine can add a lot, and it can be the center of experience of hybrid war. But also, I would like to propose to identify that we should build the center on the basis of a deep and systemic state and private partnership. This is important because in our society we have great experience, not only at the expert level. There should be synergy, and this should be done in the context of creating training and education center on hybrid war, and we discussed these issues before, and this project will be very important and interesting, not only in the context of creating the institution, but this is really good idea that can have good results. About Black Sea region and the block of the program that accumulated here and continue to be accumulated. This is a very important discussion. I would like to thank Maidan of Foreign Affairs that they deal with these issues and are trying. They will conduct a forum on this issue. And also, you mentioned that this is an issue more broad, that we should take into account political issues, not only the Black Sea region, but also the Baltics. And in the context of this cluster that you proposed, we can create the Black Sea and the Baltic cluster. Maybe if we consider common risks and common response, maybe that will be really important. And defense cluster, are you speaking about cooperation in, only in the military sphere, or this is a broader issue? I believe that this should be a broad issue. This is the issue of policy, geopolicy, economy, and of course military things that are in the industrial cooperation sphere. So thank you.
Ivan Zayas, first deputy head of the NGO Ukrainian movement to NATO. I think we should slightly extend the topicality of our discussions. This document which you presented today, it perfectly is doing this. And this is a big advantage of this document. But I believe that a shortcoming, not only of this document, but the shortcoming of the entire policy which we try to implement in this at the regional level, is the lack of strategic vision. The policy of reloading relations with Russia, it went bankrupt, but we should think carefully what should be instead. The second is that the old policy of secure Europe without Ukraine, it also went bankrupt. Ukraine should be part of the European security system. What do I mean? That in section 1, you should not oppose Ukrainian narrative about membership in NATO to the aspects of successful transformations. I think that these things should go together. Moreover, Ukrainian expectations as to NATO membership, they should go first, and then Ukraine is motivated to do its transformations. I think that we won't be able to implement our to develop roadmap of Ukrainian reforms without such a clear objective as to become members of NATO. And we should not deceive ourselves. We should get the answer. We should give the answer. You should give the answer to Ukraine as to Ukraine's future membership in NATO, and to confirm the Bucharest memorandum that Ukraine will sooner or later become member of NATO. This is the issue of strategic planning, and I disagree that this issue should be ignored. Ukrainian authorities also should clearly say that the geopolitical situation has changed because Russia had started its aggression against Ukraine. The Brexit exists, and the Netherlands' position as to association agreement also showed that geopolitical situation is changing. And one more argument why this clear statement is needed. Our Fund of Democratic Initiatives, Fund of Vilka Kuchev, showed that people have expectations as to the membership in NATO, and our politicians should not ignore this position of ordinary people. We should not think that it is not just the war in Ukraine which changed this public opinion so radically, but today there are many young people who join the social activities and also the unclear objectives proclaimed by Ukrainian authorities, they also promoted this position of people. When Mr. Grossman, speaking to Mr. Steinmeier, mentioned that it was not NATO which shaked the sword. This was Russia which shaked the sword and ruined all the principles of peaceful coexistence in Europe after the Second World War. And one more problem for us, our home assignment. Besides the sociological service, a big part of Ukrainian population residing in the eastern and southern parts of the countries, they stand for neutral status of Ukraine, non-joining the blocs. But everybody understands that it was just a technology used by Yanukovych allies who wanted to move away from NATO. Today, we should point out to the responsibility of NATO in terms of its allies and in terms of partner countries. For example, Ukraine. Ukraine participates in many NATO programs. And here we have to work, and I mean civil society, mass media, they should counteract this idea of neutrality, of non-joining NATO. You can clearly observe what's going on in this sphere after Brexit. Everybody started to shout that Europe does not exist anymore, and Ukraine has to rely on its own. Of course, we have to rely on our forces, but in a direction of Euro-Atlantic option and stand for our interests, and not to think that we will able to build up our own secure village in the midst of the global world. And we should respond not just to today's threats, but to the threats of the future, and should adapt in advance to the threats of the future. I believe that in Warsaw Summit, unless they do not reconfirm the Bucharest Summit decision, they won't emphasize that they are ready to tomorrow. In Warsaw, they will confirm the strategic defense bulletin, and which is about modernization of the Ukrainian armed forces. NATO definitely knows where we wish to go. NATO is ready to assist us. Maybe not all the member countries understands what they wish to do. And Bruno, as our real friend, pointed out that besides the narrative about our willingness to join NATO, we should speak about our efforts to change. That improper formulations in the documents, uncertain formulations in the document, do not result in positive things. The clear position NATO should be reconfirmed in the NATO documents. They offered open door policy. They mentioned that Russian veto won't be so NATO should take some responsibilities in terms of the document that they signed. They should understand that we are at the front line. We contribute to the security of the NATO countries. I understand you.
I have one short but very actual question. Tomorrow, really, summit NATO will start. As you know, only once for 2 years such kind of events we have. And the expectations are quite high, especially here in Ukraine. Could you please provide us with your expectation, what this summit can bring? And particularly in the context of last statement made by Minister of Defense of Poland, that there will be a decision, historical decision, which will push Russia to leave Ukraine. Fantastic statement, actually. But what kind of decision we can expect? Thank you very much. Maybe, Nataliya, to the extent possible officially, and Bruno more as expert. Thank you very much.
Right. I will come to the NATO summit tomorrow, but I feel poised to say a few words on this NATO enlargement thing and Ukraine. Look, I think we need to have a dual vision here. The Bucharest Declaration is an important document, and no one has forgotten about this. It's still there, it still exists. And the Bucharest Declaration should probably be the base for your long-term diplomatic objectives with NATO. But what my report says is that the Bucharest Declaration should not be the base of your communication with NATO. Look, if you go to Brussels and Washington and just say like, hey guys, but you told us in 2008 that we'll become member, you won't get any traction. Sorry, it's just a reality. It's a fact. And look, the open door policy is not dead. Montenegro just joined. But it's true that NATO is perhaps a bit more ambiguous about its objectives, enlargement objectives in Eastern Europe. That is true. But so Ukraine has a challenge of being more strategic and more clever about how it communicates to NATO about its ambitions. And putting the hammer on this Bucharest Declaration is just too narrow. You got to think bigger. And as we recommend, to also talk about your achievements, how you're actually working towards this Bucharest Declaration. That should be the focus of your communication. And this is what the report is all about. So I don't want to dismiss this Bucharest Declaration. It's an important document to define your diplomatic objectives with NATO, but it should not be the only base for your communication. And that's the whole point of the report. Right, about tomorrow, or in 2 days. Well, what will be decided in Warsaw, I think it's already pretty much known. I have no clue what the Polish defense minister meant with his statement. I'm sorry. But, I mean, look, one thing we got to understand here, actually this Warsaw Summit is fairly historical. The decision to put those rotating battalions on the eastern flank is so important. For the very first time in NATO history, the first line of defense will no longer be central Germany. It will now be a line stretching from the Baltics to the Black Sea. And that's just historical for NATO. So we should not underestimate the military and political significance of this decision. And this will really be the epicenter of the whole summit, basically. There are also a couple of other decisions that will be made. There's no need to be in detail, but I think that the Warsaw Summit will really also try to have a 360 view on its neighborhood. There's not only issues in Eastern Europe, but there are also a lot of member states that care what's happening in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East and North Africa. including my country, for instance. I am Belgian. We very much care about, issues such as terrorism and what's happening from the Middle East and there. So my understanding is that NATO will also want to demonstrate its dedication to the southern flank. I think there's a potential that NATO will now basically use its AWACS to monitor what's happening in Iraq and Syria, to basically help NATO and the US-led coalition to gather more intelligence and information. And I mean, another variety of decisions, but I really do think that it's about placing those battalions, those rotating battalions on the eastern flank, which really is the epicenter of Warsaw, and a historical decision indeed. But I'm just a modest expert here, and we have a NATO official sitting next to me, actually.
Sorry, I can't add anything as to what the president of Poland meant, but we'll see tomorrow. We'll see tomorrow at Warsaw.
Це, напевно, будуть два останні запитання.
Я буду дуже короткий на фоні поважних пані. У нас, крім Будапештського меморандуму, у нас ще один є дуже цінний папір, який підписаний зрозуміло яким, і якому присвячено було майже півдня на парламентській асамблеї НАТО, що відбувалося на Сфермонті в Києві. Це і Мінські домовленості. Мінськ-2, тобто, скажімо, чи можливо б піднімати зміни цього формату, який ні до чого не доводить, тобто Україна виконує свою частину, а Росія не виконує. Тобто це є спосіб піднімати дискурс, тобто, принаймні, українська сторона, це на фоні депутатів і журналістів піднімала відверто, що він себе вичерпав. Це пані Наталія була свідком, я її там бачив.
В чому суть запитання?
Заміна, альтернатива Мінську-2. Тобто він не працює. Тобто у нас є гаряча фаза.
Не зовсім тема нашого заходу.
Я розумію, просто...
Євген Кирилович допоможе. Будь ласка.
Дякую. Віталій Мартинюк, Український незалежний центр політичних досліджень. Рік тому, в червні 2015 року, НАТО в принципі схвалило відкриття нового цільового фонду з розмінування. Пройшов рік, остаточне рішення так і не було затверджено, а в бюлетні НАТО за липень 2016 року тільки зазначено оте минулорічне рішення. Чому, що трапилось, чому цей фонд так і не був запущений і коли його можна очікувати? Які причини зволікань? Дякую.
Я думаю, що певний вже прогрес в цьому плані є. І я так переглянула, щоб перевірити ще раз, що в цьому пакеті допомоги, яка буде надана Україні, саме цей Trust Fund і згадується. Отже, наскільки я розумію, наскільки ми бачимо, зараз вже і запускається вже робота по цьому напрямку. Отже, скажімо, прогрес вже йде.
Yeah, maybe shortly on Minsk. Now, let's be frank here. Everyone knows that Minsk is not perfect. And, no one makes a secret out of that. Especially it's not helpful if certain party does not respect certain clause that is in there. But I want to say one thing about Minsk, and perhaps this is the way that you should look at it. Minsk is actually the only document that we have in order to make sure that the European Union sustains its sanctions against Russia. Because EU sanctions are linked to Minsk. So even though, perhaps Minsk is not perfect, as long as you have Minsk, the EU is likely to, not only the EU, also the Americans and some other nations are probably, expected to have these sanctions. And in that light, it is helpful to have Minsk for Ukraine. So we should not just dismiss it because certain agreements written on paper are not working. It's those sanction thing. So that's how I would look at Minsk.
Дуже дякую всім за участь. Наш захід добіг.
Thank you very much to all the participants. We exhausted our time and we can